All right, so let's jump into this Bangor housing study. We've got like a pretty in-depth report here, packed with, all this data and insights on the city's housing market. I guess our mission, if you want to call it that, is to kind of figure out what's really going on in Bangor with housing and maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot to unpack here. One of the things that I found really interesting is how the report, it starts by painting this picture of a city that's in a bit of a population paradox. Even though Maine's population is growing, Bangor's is actually shrinking.
Shrinking city in a growing state. Yeah, that's definitely a head scratcher. So what's the story there?
Well, according to the study, Bangor has lost almost 2,000 working-age adults since 2012, and about the same number of households earning less than $75,000. So, where are they going? Why are they leaving? The report doesn't really give us all the answers, but it does point to this other trend that Bangor is getting older. There's been like a 28% increase in the senior population, while younger folks seem to be heading for the exits.
So we've got a city that's losing working age residents and at the same time attracting more seniors. So, what does this mean for the types of housing Bangor needs?
That's a key question. And the report, I think, is right to point to a housing shortage, like as a major issue. There simply aren't enough homes for the people who want to live in Bangor. And this shortage seems to be especially tough for smaller homes, like studios and one-bedroom apartments.
Okay, so shrinking, aging population, and not enough housing, especially for smaller households. Is this where the affordability crisis comes in?
Exactly. Rents and home prices in Bangor have been, going through the roof. In 2022, the report says that the median income household couldn't afford the median priced home. So, even if there were enough homes, a big chunk of the population just, couldn't afford them anyway.
Ouch. Yeah, that's a tough situation. What's driving this affordability crisis?
Well, the study kind of digs into some of the factors at play here. And one big one is the rising cost of construction. It's just gotten so expensive to build new housing. And that's, made worse by rising interest rates, too.
So are developers just choosing to build in other areas, where they can get a better return on their investment?
Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. The report suggests that, like regional developers, they might be drawn to markets with higher rents or home prices, which leaves Bangor in a bit of a bind.
So I guess it's not just about encouraging more housing development. It's about making sure that development is financially feasible for those doing the building. But is there anything like keeping people from selling their homes?
That's another interesting point the report brings up. They talk about something called market churn stagnation, which basically means people just, aren't selling their homes as often as they used to.
So what's behind the stagnation? Are people just staying put because they love Bangor that much?
Well, Bangor is a great city, but the report suggests this slowdown in sales. It could be because there just aren't enough downsizing options, especially for seniors. Think about it if you're an older homeowner and you want to move into a smaller, more manageable place. But those options just aren't available. You're probably just going to stay put.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I imagine when people stay in their homes longer, that reduces the overall number of homes for sale, which can further tighten the market and drive up prices, right?
Exactly. It's like a chain reaction. And this lack of housing options, it goes beyond just downsizing for seniors. The report points out this critical gap in what they call the missing middle.
The missing middle, what's that?
So it refers to the lack of townhomes in Bangor. The report argues that townhomes could be a great option for both, first-time buyers who might not be able to afford a single-family home and seniors looking to downsize.
But Bangor just doesn't have many townhomes. Why not?
Well, the report highlights a specific zoning regulation that might be kind of hindering their development. There's a rule that requires these minimum lot sizes for townhomes, which makes them less appealing to developers, especially on smaller lots that are common in downtown Bangor.
So zoning regulations could be playing a role in limiting the types of housing being built, even if those types of housing are in high demand.
Exactly. And it's important to note that the city isn't completely ignoring the housing issue. The report does mention that Bangor has, they've done some things, they've implemented some zoning changes in recent years, like allowing accessory dwelling units, reducing lot sizes in some residential zones. They've even permitted tiny home parks.
So they are at least trying to address the problem, but have those changes been effective? What else can they do?
And that's where the report, I think, really gets interesting. It outlines this whole range of potential solutions, everything from financial incentives for developers to streamlining the permitting process. It even explores the idea of a dedicated fund to support affordable housing projects.
Okay, so we've got this picture of like the problem, shrinking, aging population, housing shortage, skyrocketing costs, and, some potential roadblocks in the form of zoning regulations. But it sounds like the city is at least exploring some options for tackling these challenges. What about what's actually been built in Bangor recently?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, the report actually goes into some detail about that. It highlights the fact that a lot of the new rental units in Bangor, they've come from renovations of historic buildings downtown, not from brand new construction.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. The report mentions Tower 99 on Franklin Street and a project on Exchange Street. Both of those involve converting, existing buildings into apartments.
So I guess developers are just finding it more feasible to work with what's already there instead of starting from scratch. Why do you think that is?
Well, the report points to a few reasons. High construction costs are definitely a factor, as well as the prevalence of small or irregular lots downtown,
Right.
which can, make new construction more challenging.
It's like they're trying to,
Yeah.
to make the most of what they already have. And, it's not just about creating new housing, right? It's also about preserving the city's history and character.
Absolutely. The report even suggests that Bangor could. They could look at repurposing older office buildings downtown, which could be a win-win, preserving history and creating much-needed housing.
That's a great idea. What about for sale housing? Has there been much new construction on that front?
The report highlights the Maine Woods subdivision as, a notable recent development. It's a project that will eventually include 30 homes, all with 3 bedrooms.
3 bedrooms. That's interesting, considering, we've been talking about the need for smaller units.
Right. And the report acknowledges that these larger subdivision projects, like Maine Woods,
Yeah.
they haven't been as common in Bangor. They just require more infrastructure investment like roads and utilities, and the planning costs can be, really high.
So are we seeing a trend toward smaller scale projects in Bangor for both, rental and for sale housing?
I think that's a fair assessment. And, it's likely a reflection of the challenges and the costs associated with larger developments in the current market. But this raises a really important question. Are those smaller projects enough to meet, the city's growing housing needs?
That's a great question. And it's one, I think we need to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the report.
Yeah, definitely. Because, to really understand the housing situation in Bangor, we need to look beyond just the supply side. We also need to consider the demand side. How are people actually experiencing this market? What are their struggles, their frustrations?
That's a great point. And the report, thankfully, does go into that. It talks about how this affordability crisis is impacting, actual residents. For starters, it points out that rents have been rising steadily over the past decade.
Yeah, and that increase has it's sped up in recent years with 6.5% compound annual growth rate between 2020 and 2022. That's a pretty significant jump.
And it's not just rents, right? Home prices have also been, going way up, like an 11% compound annual growth rate between 2020 and 2024.
Yeah, it really paints this picture of a market that's just becoming increasingly out of reach.
Yeah.
For a lot of residents.
Exactly. And the report provides some pretty stark data to back that up. For example, it states that there's a shortage of 700 homes for households that earn less than $35,000.
Which means that a lot of renters, they're forced to pay more than what their income can realistically support. The report uses this term, cost burdened, which refers to the percentage of a household's income.
Yeah.
That goes towards housing.
And when that percentage gets too high, it can put a real strain on a household's budget and lead to, financial instability.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. The report says that 86% of households that earn 50% of the area in median income or less are cost burdened.
That's a huge GE number, and it's especially concerning because the report also points out that cost-burdened households are disproportionately made up of seniors.
Which, kind of is back to what we were talking about earlier about the need for more senior-friendly housing options.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? Seniors on fixed incomes are especially vulnerable to rising housing costs. And the lack of affordable downsizing options just makes the problem worse.
It really highlights how, interconnected all these issues are. And to make things even more complex, the report says that, since the pandemic, the income you need to buy a median-priced home in Bangor, it's actually higher now than the median household income. This is the first time this has happened in the past decade.
Wow. So for the first time in recent history, the average family in Bangor can no longer afford to buy the average home. I mean, that raises some serious questions about the long term, sustainability of the city's housing market. If working families can't afford to buy homes, what does that mean for the future of Bangor?
That is the critical question, and it's one that, city leaders will need to figure out if they want to ensure that Bangor is, a vibrant and thriving community for years to come. Yeah, it is a critical question, but thankfully the report doesn't just lay out the problems. It also explores like some potential solutions, kind of offers a roadmap, so to speak, for how Bangor can address this housing crisis and create a more equitable and sustainable future for, all its residents.
It's good to hear. Yeah, I'm all for a little dose of optimism. After that rather sobering picture of the challenges they're facing.
Right. It's not all doom and gloom. And I think the report makes a really important point. The city can't just build its way out of this problem. It's not just about quantity. It's also about quality, affordability, and making sure that the right kinds of housing are available for, the people who need the most.
So it's about being strategic.
Yeah.
And targeted in their approach.
Exactly. And to kind of help with that, the report dives into three main categories of housing tools: land use, tenants' rights, and public subsidies.
Okay, let's break those down. What do they mean by land use?
So land use refers to how the city uses zoning regulations and, other policies to encourage or sometimes unintentionally discourage housing development.
So things like allowing for greater density or reducing parking requirements or even streamlining the permitting process.
You got it. The goal is to make it easier and more appealing for developers to build, the kind of housing Bangor needs. And it's worth noting that Bangor has actually made some progress in this area. They've enacted several land use policy changes in recent years, like allowing accessory dwelling units, reducing lot sizes in some residential zones, and even permitting tiny home parks.
Okay, so it sounds like they're moving in the right direction. But will these changes actually, get more housing built?
Well, the report is kind of cautious here. It suggests that land use tools alone might not be enough to overcome, the market barriers to housing supply in Bangor. Because even if it's easier to build, it still has to be financially viable for developers.
Sure.
And with, construction costs being what they are, that can be a really big hurdle.
So even if you clear the regulatory path, there's still the issue of, the bottom line.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of public subsidies comes in. The report argues that the city might need to, allocate some resources, including, local funding, to encourage and subsidize new housing development, particularly for affordable housing.
So things like providing grants or low-interest loans to developers who are building affordable housing.
Yeah, exactly. Or offering tax breaks or other financial incentives. The idea is to help bridge that gap between what it costs to build affordable housing and what the market can actually support, essentially, or making it more financially attractive for developers to build housing that meets the needs of a wider range of, residents.
That makes sense. But where would the money come from? Would the city have to raise taxes?
Not necessarily. The report suggests a couple of different options. The city could, dedicate a portion of its existing funds or create, new revenue streams specifically for affordable housing, maybe through a dedicated housing trust fund or by allocating a percentage of property tax revenue to affordable housing initiatives.
Yeah, I've heard of those housing trust funds. Aren't those pretty common in other cities?
They are. And they can be a really effective way to create this sustainable source of funding for affordable housing projects. The report even suggests that Bangor could, take it a step further and establish a revolving loan fund specifically for affordable housing.
Now that's interesting. What's a revolving loan fund?
A pretty cool concept. It's basically a system where money that's repaid by one project is then used to, finance the next one. So it creates this kind of, self-sustaining cycle of affordable housing development.
So it's like a pay-it-forward system for affordable housing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But regardless of how the city chooses to fund these efforts, I think the report is right to emphasize the importance of using those funds strategically and transparently, with clear guidelines and accountability measures. They even propose that the city could, issue an annual request for proposals, or RFP, for, the available funds.
So developers and nonprofits could, submit proposals for specific affordable housing projects that align with the city's priorities.
That's right. And then the city could evaluate those proposals.
Yeah.
Based on, clear criteria, like how well they align with city priorities, efficient use of funds, and, the likelihood of the project being successful.
It sounds like a a pretty solid, well-structured approach.
It is.
Yeah.
And the report also stresses that. The city should negotiate strong terms to protect its investment in these projects, while also, ensuring project feasibility.
So making sure that the projects are not only good for the community, but also make sense, financially.
Exactly. And that the city should, monitor compliance and track the impact of the funds over time, just to make sure everything's on track.
It sounds like they've really thought this through.
They have. But they don't stop there. The report also explores, the role of tenants' rights in creating a more stable and equitable housing market.
So things like just cause eviction protections or legal assistance for tenants facing eviction, or even establishing rent control.
Well, the report doesn't necessarily, endorse any specific policy, but it does argue that tenants' rights tools, even if they don't directly increase the housing supply, can play a really critical role in, preserving existing affordable housing and protecting, vulnerable tenants from displacement.
So it's about creating a safety net for renters.
Exactly, especially those who are, most at risk of losing their homes. And it's worth mentioning that Bangor has already implemented some tenants' rights measures. They've adopted a tenants' housing rights ordinance that regulates certain, landlord practices and requires written notice for rent increases.
So they're already doing some things in this area.
They are. They've also piloted a rental registry and strategic code enforcement for long-term rentals.
Okay, so it sounds like they're taking some good steps towards, making the rental market fairer and more balanced for both, tenants and landlords.
Exactly. But the report does acknowledge that. Tenants' rights measures can sometimes be controversial. Some people argue that they can, discourage investment in rental properties, which could lead to, unintended consequences, like higher rents for everyone.
Yeah, I can see how that could happen if landlords feel like, they're being unfairly squeezed.
Right. It's a complex issue, and the report suggests that. The city should really carefully consider, the potential impacts of any new tenants' rights policies and, engage in a robust public dialogue before implementing them.
So finding solutions that work for, both renters and landlords, recognizing that both are essential to a healthy housing ecosystem.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So we've talked about land use, public subsidies, and tenants' rights. But what about the types of housing that are most needed in Bangor?
The report identifies three priority populations for whom the city should, focus its housing efforts. First, low and moderate income workers, which makes sense given what we saw in the report about Bangor losing a significant number of those households in recent years.
Right. And, if businesses can't find workers who can afford to live in the city, they can have this, ripple effect on the local economy. The second priority population is first-time homebuyers.
Again, makes sense, given that the report found that, the median income household can no longer afford to buy the median-priced home in Bangor.
It's a huge barrier to home ownership.
Yeah.
For, young people and families just starting out. And then, finally, the report highlights the need for more senior-friendly housing.
Options for downsizing and aging in place.
Exactly. The report argues that. These are the groups that are most vulnerable to the housing crisis, and that the city should really prioritize their needs when developing, housing solutions.
So they've got the who. What about the what? What kinds of housing do they need?
Yeah, so the report gets pretty specific here. It identifies several types of housing that are in high demand, but short supply in Bangor. First on the list, smaller homes, specifically studio and one-bedroom apartments.
Again, that makes sense. We've already talked about, the growing number of one-person households in Bangor, driven by, the aging population and fewer families.
Exactly. And, the lack of these smaller, more affordable units, it could be a big reason why. Younger people are leaving the city. They just, can't find a place to live that fits their needs and their budget.
Okay, so studios and one-bedrooms. What else?
Next up, townhomes. You remember those? The report points out that townhomes could be, a really good option for both first-time buyers and seniors looking to downsize. They're often more affordable than single-family homes, and they require less maintenance.
They kind of hit that sweet spot in the middle.
Right. The missing middle, as the report calls it. But, we've already talked about how Bangor doesn't have many townhomes. And the report suggests that the city could, consider some zoning changes to encourage more townhome construction.
Maybe by allowing them in more residential districts?
Yeah.
Or by reducing minimum lot size requirements?
Exactly. Anything to make them more, feasible to build, especially in areas where land is, like, really expensive.
Okay, so smaller units, townhomes. What's the third type of housing they highlight?
The report emphasizes the need for more multi-unit homes, especially smaller units located, near downtown.
That makes sense, for young workers and seniors who want to be close to, amenities and services and public transportation.
And it aligns with what we've heard from stakeholders. There's a strong demand for, like, downtown living. People want that, walkable, vibrant urban experience.
So it seems like there's a pretty clear consensus that Bangor needs, a more diverse housing stock with more options for different household sizes, income levels, and lifestyles.
Absolutely. And that achieving this diversity will require, like, this multifaceted approach, land use policy changes, public subsidies, and a real focus on developing the types of housing that are, most needed by the community.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty tall order. But I think the report makes a really strong case for why this is so important, not just for the well-being of current residents, but for the long term, health and vitality of the city itself.
Really is a call to action for city leaders, developers, residents.
Work together to create a Bangor where everyone has access to safe, affordable, and quality housing. So we've delved into the problem, the challenges, and explored, a range of potential solutions. It's a lot to take in, but, this is the deep dive. So we like to, leave our listeners with something extra to think about. What's the final provocative thought that this Bangor housing study leaves us with? One thing that's really struck me as we've been going through this report is this link between housing and a city's, like, overall vibrancy.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge connection. I think this report does a really good job of, of highlighting that. Housing isn't just about, like, putting roofs over people's heads.
Yeah.
It's also about, attracting talent, retaining talent. It's about economic growth. It's about building this strong sense of community.
It's like housing is the foundation. And if that foundation is shaky, the whole structure is kind of at risk.
Exactly. I mean, if people can't afford to live somewhere, they're just going to go somewhere else. And that can, like, really drain a city of its energy, its workforce, its creative spirit,
Yeah, and I imagine it would be especially tough for a city like Bangor, which is, trying to attract those young professionals, families, while also supporting its aging population.
Oh, absolutely. The report talks about how if, young professionals who often bring those new ideas, if they get priced out of the market, it hurts the city's ability to grow and change with the times.
And on the other hand, if seniors are having trouble finding housing, that meets their needs. They might move away too, taking their experience, their connections, the knowledge of the community with them.
It's a loss for the city either way. And it creates this, like, ripple effect that touches, pretty much every part of a city's fabric. Businesses can't find workers. Schools see enrollment decline. The sense of community weakens.
So this report isn't just about housing policy. It's about, economic development, social equity, and the long-term, like, sustainability of Bangor.
It really is. It's about creating a city where everyone feels welcome, valued, and have the opportunity to, to thrive. And a big part of that is making sure that everyone has access to housing they can afford.
And housing that, meets their needs at different points in their lives.
Yeah.
It's about fostering that sense of belonging, that sense of community, that shared investment in the future.
Exactly. And while this report, it brings up a lot of important questions, some of them, kind of tough questions.
Yeah.
It also gives me a sense of hope. It shows that, like, Bangor is aware of these challenges, and they're actively looking for solutions.
They've taken some steps, but there's definitely more work to be done.
Yeah, for sure. And it's important to remember that this isn't just a Bangor problem. Cities all over the country are facing this. So what happens in Bangor, it could be a model for other communities that are, dealing with these same challenges.
It's a chance for Bangor to be a leader, right?
Yeah.
To show that it is possible to create a housing market that works for everyone. So as you, the listener, continue to learn about this study, we want to leave you with this final thought. Imagine a city where housing is seen as not just a commodity, but as a fundamental right.
A city where everyone has a place to call home, a place to feel safe, a place to build a life. Think about what it would take to make that a reality, not just in Bangor, but everywhere. And that's our deep dive for today.